In the autumn of 1874, a boy named Samuel Harker arrived in Salem, a city whose name, derived from the Hebrew for peace, belied a history etched in turmoil and suspicion. The boy was a wraith, a sliver of a child no more than 9 years of age, delivered to the steps of the First Parish Church by a distant cousin, a grim-faced fisherman who spoke in clipped tones of a fire. He described a coastal blaze, a conflagration that had devoured a row of wooden shacks near the wharf in a neighboring town, and with them, Samuel's entire world. The boy's mother and father, simple fishing folk, had been consumed by the flames, leaving him an orphan, a piece of human driftwood washed ashore by a tide of tragedy. If you are drawn to the quiet archives where such unsettling histories are kept, and this is your first time in our collection, consider subscribing to ensure these case files remain open to you. The parish took him in, as Christian charity and civic duty demanded. In an era where orphans were often seen as a public burden, sometimes indentured or sent away on trains to uncertain futures in the West, the church offered a sanctuary of sorts. The women of the congregation clucked over him, their sympathy a thick, palpable thing. They noted the hollowness of his cheeks, the startling, oversized quality of his eyes, which seemed too ancient and too knowing for his slender face. He was given a small room in the rectory attic, a space that smelled of dry paper, old wood, and the faint, sweet scent of decaying hymnals. It was a lonely perch, but the boy expressed no complaint. In fact, he expressed nothing at all. This was the first and most profound mystery of Samuel Harker, his unsettling, preternatural calmness. He did not weep for his lost parents. He did not rage against the fate that had rendered him so utterly alone. He moved through his new life with a silent, watchful grace that was more unnerving than any childhood tantrum could ever be. The other children of the parish, who at first approached him with the cautious curiosity they might afford a stray animal, soon retreated from his silent orbit. They would later tell their parents that Samuel did not play, that he simply stood at the edge of the churchyard, his gaze fixed on the imposing granite facade of the church itself, as if waiting for it to speak. The pastor of the First Parish Church was a man named Elias Alden. He was a second-generation clergyman, a man whose faith had been inherited like a piece of antique furniture, solid and respectable, yet showing the subtle wear of time and familiarity. For more than 2 decades, he had guided his flock through the predictable rhythms of birth, marriage, and death, his sermons offering a steady, if uninspired, comfort. The Reverend was a man of routine and order, finding solace in the predictable cadence of Scripture and the comforting weight of his pastoral duties. His only small vanity was a pair of silver spectacles, which he polished with a specific, methodical circular motion whenever he was faced with a problem that liturgy could not solve. He had seen his share of grief, of children struck dumb by loss, but the boy, Samuel, was different. The Reverend observed him from the window of his study, watching as the boy stood motionless in the graveyard, his small form silhouetted against the slate-gray sky of a New England autumn. It was not the stillness of shock, the Reverend concluded, for he had seen that many times. It was the stillness of intense, focused observation. The boy's attention was not directed at the weathered tombstones or the skeletal branches of the ancient elms, but always, unerringly, at the church. Specifically, the Reverend began to notice Samuel's gaze was fixed upon the high, arched windows that flanked the main altar. The church itself was a formidable structure, a product of the Gothic Revival style that had found favor in New England decades earlier. It was built to inspire awe and humility, its stone walls thick and cold, its spire a finger pointing accusingly at the heavens. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of flickering candles, a mixture of beeswax, incense, and the damp, earthy smell of wet stone that seeped up from the crypts below. Light, when it penetrated the sanctuary, was filtered through stained glass, painting the stone floors in bruised jewel tones of sapphire, ruby, and emerald. It was a place designed for solemn introspection, a fortress against the sins of the outside world. Yet, to the Reverend, who knew its every creak and shadow, it had become familiar, its mysteries long since faded into the comforting wallpaper of his daily life. He found himself polishing his spectacles with increasing frequency as he watched the orphan. What did the boy see? What secret was he attempting to divine from the patterns of colored light and cold stone? The Reverend, a man whose profession was rooted in the interpretation of the unseen, felt a prickle of unease, a sense that some older, more formidable mystery was unfolding just beyond the periphery of his well-ordered world. His concern was not for the boy's soul, not yet, but for the profound and unnerving silence that seemed to emanate from him, a silence that felt less like an absence of sound and more like a presence of something else entirely. The first Sunday of Samuel's residence at the parish arrived with a chill wind that rattled the stained glass windows in their leaded frames. The congregation gathered, a sea of dark wool and sober faces, their footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. The Reverend ascended the pulpit, the familiar feel of the carved oak beneath his hands a small anchor in a suddenly uncertain sea. He had taken pains to ensure the boy was seated in the front pew, beside the wife of one of the church deacons, a woman known for her maternal, if somewhat overbearing, demeanor. He hoped the familiar ritual of the service, the rising and falling cadence of the hymns, the communal murmur of prayer, would act as a balm, grounding the boy in the comforting embrace of the community. For the first hour, it seemed to work. Samuel sat perfectly still, his hands folded in his lap, his gaze fixed, as always, upon the altar. The Reverend's voice filled the sanctuary, speaking of parables and redemption, the words worn smooth by centuries of repetition. The scent of old wood and incense hung thick in the air, a familiar perfume of piety. The candles on the altar flickered, their small flames dancing in the drafts that snaked through the ancient building, casting long, wavering shadows that seemed to writhe and recoil from the sacred space. The sermon was approaching its gentle, reassuring conclusion when the disruption occurred. It was not a shout, not a cry, but a sound far more arresting in the hallowed silence, a whisper. It was a sibilant, penetrating sound, clear and cold as the winter air outside. The deacon's wife, who sat beside Samuel, was the first to react. Her head snapped toward the boy, her brow furrowed in a mixture of confusion and stern disapproval. A few others in the front pews turned, their prayers faltering on their lips. The Reverend paused, losing his place in the well-worn text. He looked down from the pulpit and saw the boy, Samuel, leaning toward the woman, his lips moving almost imperceptibly. His eyes, however, were not on her. They were locked on a space near the altar, a patch of empty air just to the left of the communion rail. The Reverend cleared his throat, intending to gently admonish the child for the interruption, to bring the service, and his own sense of order, back under control. But then the deacon's wife's face, which had been set in lines of pious irritation, slackened into an expression of profound bewilderment. She leaned back from the boy as if he were a source of sudden, intense heat. She looked from his face to the empty space near the altar, and then back again. The whispers from the congregation grew, a restless tide of curiosity and unease. The Reverend descended from the pulpit, his heart a heavy, rhythmic drum against his ribs. He knelt before the pew, placing a hand on the boy's thin shoulder. He asked him what was wrong, what he had said to so startle the good woman beside him. Samuel did not seem to hear him at first. His focus was absolute, his small body rigid with concentration. The Reverend asked again, his voice firmer this time, an edge of pastoral authority creeping into his tone. Finally, the boy turned his head, his ancient eyes meeting the Reverend's. His voice, when it came, was not the voice of a child lost in fancy. It was quiet, matter-of-fact, and utterly devoid of emotion. He told the Reverend that he was sorry for the interruption. He explained, with the simple, unassailable logic of the very young, that he had only whispered because he did not want to disturb the other person who was praying. The Reverend's hand tightened on the boy's shoulder. He followed Samuel's gaze to the empty space near the altar. There was nothing there but the cold flagstones, the ancient, carved wood of the communion rail, and the wavering, distorted reflections of the candlelight. He asked the boy what he meant. Who else, he inquired, was praying? The air in the church grew thick and still, the collective breath of the congregation held in suspense. Samuel Harker looked back at the altar, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. He reported that it was an old woman. He described her with a startling, simple clarity. He said she was kneeling, her back very straight, dressed entirely in mourning black. Her head was bowed, he continued, and her hands were clasped so tightly that her knuckles were white. The boy's words fell into the silence of the church like stones into a deep well. The congregation stared, first at the child, then at the empty space he described with such conviction. A cold draft seemed to sweep through the sanctuary, though the heavy oak doors remained firmly closed. The Reverend felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. He was a man of God, a man who preached of angels and spirits, of a world beyond the veil of mortal sight. But his faith was a structured, theoretical thing, contained within the safe confines of Scripture and Sunday sermons. This, however, felt different. This felt like an intrusion. He dismissed the boy's words as a childish fantasy, a story born of trauma and an overactive imagination. He reassured the concerned faces of his congregation, offered a hasty benediction, and brought the service to an abrupt and unsatisfying close. He told himself it was nothing. But as he led the silent, unnervingly calm boy from the church, a single, terrifying question began to form in the deepest recesses of his mind. Who was the old woman the boy claimed to see, and why, in the house of God, a vision of prayer felt so utterly and profoundly unholy? He would cling to his disbelief, to the rational explanations that had always served him so well, but that foundation was already beginning to crumble. The dismissal would hold for a time, a fortress of reason against a rising tide of the inexplicable, until the boy, in his quiet, unassuming way, began to describe details about the church's past, details that no orphan child, newly arrived in Salem, could possibly know. The Reverend's dismissal of the boy's vision was a conscious act of will, a deliberate shuttering of a door he did not wish to open. He attributed the incident to the lingering echoes of trauma, a child's mind creating phantoms to populate the vast, empty space left by his parents. For a few days, a fragile and carefully constructed sense of normalcy returned to the rectory. Samuel remained as silent and watchful as ever, a small, quiet ghost haunting the periphery of parish life. He took his simple meals in the rectory kitchen, his eyes downcast. He performed the small chores assigned to him without complaint or comment. Yet, the Reverend could not shake the image of the boy's unblinking stare fixed upon the altar. The question of what Samuel saw there festered in the clergyman's thoughts. A splinter of doubt lodged deep in the flesh of his faith. He found himself observing the boy more closely, searching for any further sign of delusion or distress. It was during one of these observations, on a gray and windswept afternoon, that he found the first piece of tangible, terrifying evidence. He had climbed the narrow stairs to the attic room, carrying a spare blanket against the encroaching autumn chill. He found Samuel not by the window, but sitting on the floor, a piece of rough paper spread before him, and a stick of charcoal clutched in his small fingers. The Reverend stood in the doorway, his presence unnoticed. The boy was utterly absorbed in his task, his brow furrowed in concentration, the tip of his tongue caught between his teeth. The air in the small room was cold, smelling of old timber and the faint, dusty scent of charcoal. A single shaft of weak, gray light fell from the gabled window, illuminating the boy and his work. Reverend Alden expected to see a child's drawing, a crude rendering of a house or a tree, perhaps a misshapen animal. Instead, what he saw on the paper made the breath catch in his throat. Samuel was not drawing a person or a scene. He was sketching, with a precision that belied his years, a pair of hands. They were gnarled and slender, the hands of an old woman, and they were clasped tightly in the attitude of prayer. The line work was simple, yet it conveyed a sense of immense pressure, of knuckles strained white with the force of the supplication. But it was the detail on the fourth finger of the left hand that caused a cold dread to unspool in the Reverend's stomach. There, precisely rendered, was a ring. It was a simple band, adorned with a single, small, dark stone. It was not a generic representation of jewelry. It was a specific ring, drawn from a specific memory, and with a sickening, heart-stopping jolt of recognition, the Reverend knew he had seen it before. The image swam in his memory, a ghost from 2 decades past. He saw the same hands, the same ring, resting on the dark wood of a coffin lid. The memory belonged to a younger version of himself, a new curate assisting in his first funeral service at this very church. The deceased was a woman named Margaret Hale, a devout, if somewhat stern, parishioner who had succumbed to a swift and sudden illness. He remembered the quiet grief of her husband, the somber faces of her distant relations. And he remembered the ring, a piece of jet set in a plain gold band, an heirloom she had refused to remove even in her final days. The connection was impossible, a phantom thread stretching across 20 years, linking a dead woman to a drawing made by an orphaned boy who had not even been born when she was laid to rest in the churchyard. The Reverend felt a wave of vertigo, as if the solid floor of the rectory had suddenly tilted beneath his feet. He backed away from the attic door. The image of the charcoal hands burned into his mind. The boy's vision was no longer a vague fantasy. It now had a name, it had a history, and it had, impossibly, a physical artifact to anchor it in the world of the real. That night, sleep offered no refuge. The Reverend was haunted by the confluence of impossible facts. His scholarly, ordered mind railed against the implications, searching for any logical seam to unstitch the terrifying tapestry that was beginning to form. There was only one place where the threads of memory and fact could be untangled or confirmed: the church archives. Long before the dawn broke, he was in the records room, a small, stone-walled chamber in the church basement. The air was frigid and smelled of damp earth and decaying paper. Armed with a single oil lamp that cast long dancing shadows, he began his search. The parish ledgers were bound in cracking leather, their pages brittle with age. He located the records for the year 1854. His hands, he noted with a detached sense of alarm, were trembling. He found her entry in the mortuary ledger, the ink faded but still legible in the spidery script of his predecessor. Margaret Hale died October the 12th of a pulmonary fever. The details were mundane, clinical, but it was in the sexton's inventory, a log of personal effects for burials, that he found the confirmation he both sought and dreaded. Listed among the items she was to be buried with was one gold wedding band with a single jetstone. The ledger slipped from his trembling fingers, its heavy thud echoing in the tomb-like silence of the archive. The boy had seen it. He had seen the ring of a woman dead for 20 years. As the Reverend stood there, the lamplight flickering over the faded ink, he felt a profound shift in his understanding of the world. The clear, solid line between the living and the dead, between reason and the abyss, had dissolved. He was about to close the books, to retreat from the cold basement and the even colder truth it held, when a different entry on the adjacent page caught his eye. It was from the church's financial ledger, dated November 1854, just a few weeks after Margaret Hale's funeral. It was a record of an unexpected and costly expenditure. The entry detailed a significant renovation of the sanctuary. The official reason cited was the need to replace cracked foundation stones directly beneath the main altar. The work had been commissioned suddenly and completed with unusual haste. A mysterious renovation, a secret buried in the church's own financial history, coinciding almost exactly with the death of the woman whose ghost, it seemed, now knelt in prayer before the very stones that had been so hastily replaced. What had they been so eager to cover? What sin was consecrated anew beneath the altar of God? The following Sunday, a palpable tension hung in the air of the sanctuary. The story of Samuel's first outburst had circulated through the town in hushed whispers, and the congregation watched the boy in the front pew with a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity. The Reverend's sermon was strained, his words hollow. He spoke of faith in the face of the unknown, but his own was faltering, cracking under the weight of a truth he could no longer deny. He kept his eyes averted from the space beside the altar, terrified of what he might see, or what the boy might see. The service progressed uneventfully until the final hymn. As the organ swelled and the voices of the congregation rose to fill the vaulted space, Samuel, who had been sitting in his customary stillness, suddenly went rigid. His head snapped back, his eyes wide and unfocused. The deacon's wife beside him let out a small cry of alarm. The boy rose to his feet, a marionette pulled by unseen strings. His mouth opened, but the voice that emerged was not his own. It was a strained, desperate whisper that seemed to be pulled from the very depths of the earth. He said she was praying. He said she was praying for what they took from her. Then, with a final, shuddering gasp, his eyes rolled back in his head, and he collapsed onto the cold stone floor. The hymn died in a discordant crash of organ keys. Parishioners surged to their feet, their prayers forgotten in a wave of panic. The doctor, a member of the congregation, rushed forward, pushing through the stunned crowd. He knelt beside the boy's limp form, checking his pulse, his breathing. The Reverend stood frozen in the pulpit, looking down at the chaos, at the small, pale child who had become the epicenter of a storm he could not control. The doctor eventually looked up, his face a mask of professional confusion. He announced that the boy had fainted, but that his vital signs were stable. He could find no medical explanation for the sudden collapse. As the boy was carried from the church, a low murmur of fear and speculation spread through the pews. That evening, Reverend Alden made a decision. He announced to the parish council that the church would be closed for the foreseeable future, citing the need for urgent structural repairs to the foundation. It was a lie, but a necessary one. He could not risk another public incident. He needed to confront this darkness alone, away from the terrified eyes of his flock. That night, after ensuring Samuel was asleep in his attic room, the Reverend sat alone in his study, the silence of the rectory pressing in on him. He believed that by closing the church, he had contained the phenomenon. But as the clock on the mantel chimed midnight, a faint, rhythmic sound drifted through the closed windows. It was the sound of a small bell, the Sanctus bell, ringing softly, insistently, from the altar of the locked and empty church. A moment later, he heard footsteps on the stairs. It was Samuel, his face pale in the moonlight. He told the Reverend he could not sleep. He said the sound of the bells had woken him up. The closure of the First Parish Church was an unprecedented act, a stark admission that the spiritual rot afflicting the Reverend's own soul had metastasized into the public body of the congregation. He had hoped, with a desperation that felt more like fear than faith, that locking the heavy oak doors would quarantine the haunting, containing it within the cold stone walls. But the phenomenon was not a prisoner of the sanctuary. It bled through the mortar and seeped under the doors, following the boy into the rectory. The faint, ghostly ringing of the Sanctus bell became a nightly torment, a sound that seemed to emanate not from the physical bell on the altar but from some deeper, more resonant chamber within the earth itself. And each time it rang, Samuel would awaken, not in terror, but with a placid, unnerving acceptance, as if answering a familiar summons. The boy's presence in the house was a constant, silent accusation. He was a living conduit for a history the Reverend was only just beginning to comprehend, a history of secrets buried in sanctified ground. The official church archives in the basement, with their neat columns of births and deaths, had offered a confirmation of identity, but not of motive. They recorded the facts of Margaret Hale's life and death, but they were silent on the reasons why her spirit would refuse the peace of the grave. Reverend Alden knew that institutions, like men, have two histories, the one that is written down and celebrated, and the one that is sealed away and forgotten. He reasoned that his predecessor, Father Whitcomb, a man he had only known in his dotage as a stern but pious figure, must have kept private records. Such things were common among clergymen, personal ledgers for thoughts, confessions, and the less savory administrative details not suitable for the official parish logs. If a secret of the magnitude he was beginning to suspect truly existed, it would not be in the public archive. It would be hidden in the more personal, more private spaces of the man who had presided over the church in 1854. This thought led him not to the cold, damp basement, but upwards, towards the suffocating heat and forgotten memories of the rectory attic. The attic was not the boy's small, Spartan room, but a larger, communal space, a repository for the discarded remnants of previous pastoral lives. It was a place where furniture went to die, where stacks of yellowed sermons crumbled into dust, and where the ghosts of his predecessors lingered in the scent of decaying paper and cedar. On a bleak, overcast afternoon, with the sound of a rising wind moaning around the eaves of the rectory, the Reverend ascended the narrow, creaking staircase. The air in the attic was thick and still, heavy with the dust of decades. Thin, milky shafts of light pierced the gloom through a grimy bullseye window, illuminating swirling motes of dust like a galaxy of tiny, dead stars. He moved through the maze of shrouded furniture and stacked crates, his footsteps muffled by the thick carpet of dust. He was looking for a specific steamer trunk, one he remembered seeing years ago, bearing the initials of his predecessor. He found it in a far corner, tucked beneath a heap of moth-eaten vestments. The leather was cracked and brittle, the brass latches green with verdigris. It was not locked. As he lifted the heavy lid, the smell of time itself rose to meet him, a dry, almost sweet scent of old leather and preserved secrets. Inside, beneath a layer of neatly folded clerical stoles, he found them. They were not loose papers, but 3 thick, leather-bound ledgers, far more ornate than the standard parish record books, and unlike the records in the basement, these were sealed. A thick band of dried red wax was pressed over the clasp of each volume, stamped with the personal signet of Father Whitcomb, a cross intertwined with a serpent. The act of breaking the seals felt like a desecration, a violation of the tomb. His hands trembled as he used a letter opener to crack the brittle wax, the sound unnaturally loud in the profound silence of the attic. He opened the first ledger. The pages were not paper, but fine vellum, covered in his predecessor's elegant, yet severe, script. These were not mere financial records. They were a detailed, almost obsessive chronicle of the parish's inner life, a secret history of sins confessed and ambitions concealed. He scanned the entries, his eyes searching for the year 1854. He found it in the second volume. The early entries for that year were routine, detailing tithes, sermons, and minor parish disputes. But then, in the month of August, he found the name he was looking for, Margaret Hale. The entry was chilling in its dispassionate tone. Father Whitcomb recorded a private meeting with the woman, noting that she had come to him with a grave accusation. She had been a volunteer bookkeeper for the church's charitable fund, a fund established to build a new wing for the local orphanage. Her meticulous review of the accounts, the ledger stated, had revealed a significant discrepancy. A substantial sum of money, equivalent to thousands of dollars in modern currency, had vanished. She had traced the withdrawals to a series of unsigned chits, authorized for purchases of stonework and masonry supplies for which there were no corresponding projects or receipts. The implication, though unstated, was perfectly clear. The funds had been stolen. The Reverend sat back on his heels, the dust of the attic floor cold through the fabric of his trousers. The air felt thin, difficult to breathe. Here was the motive. It was not a crime of passion or a theological dispute. It was a common, sordid sin, greed, cloaked in the robes of piety. He read on, his sense of dread mounting with every turned page. A week after the entry detailing her accusation, a new entry appeared. Father Whitcomb wrote that he had met with Margaret Hale again, this time to discuss her findings in more detail. He noted that he had assured her a full internal investigation would be conducted. He praised her diligence, her commitment to the church, but it was the final line of the entry that made the Reverend's blood run cold. The predecessor wrote that he had also counseled her on the virtues of discretion, reminding her that public accusations, even if well-founded, could do irreparable harm to the reputation of the church and the faith of the flock. He had advised her to remain silent while he looked into the matter personally. It was a quiet, subtle threat, a strand of silk tightening around her throat. The next entry concerning her was dated 2 weeks later, in late September. It was brief and clinical. It noted with pastoral concern that Margaret Hale had been struck by a sudden and virulent fever. She was confined to her bed, too weak to receive visitors. The entry spoke of the fragility of life and the mysterious ways of providence. There were no more accusations. There were no more mentions of missing funds. There was only the detached, pious chronicle of a parishioner's swift decline. The final entry, from mid-October, recorded her death. Father Whitcomb wrote a short, eloquent eulogy on the vellum page, praising her quiet faith and her service to the church. He then noted, almost as an afterthought, that with the tragic passing of the only person who understood its complexities, the internal audit of the charitable fund would be indefinitely suspended. The pieces clicked into place with the terrible, final sound of a coffin lid being nailed shut. The accusation, the convenient illness, the silence. It was a murder, not by knife or poison, but by the cold, calculating hand of institutional self-preservation. The church's reputation had been protected, the theft concealed, and Margaret Hale had been silenced forever. The subsequent renovation of the altar, he now understood with sickening certainty, was not a repair. It was a concealment of the crime's true cost. He sat there for a long time, the open ledger on his lap, the dust settling around him in the dying light. The moral architecture of his world had collapsed. The church was not a fortress against sin, but a tomb built to contain it. The sanctity he had dedicated his life to serving was a facade, painted over a rot that went straight to the foundation. He was the inheritor of a lie, the unwitting guardian of a desecrated space. The distant ringing of the church bell, the real one this time, calling for vespers, startled him from his reverie. He closed the ledger, the weight of its truth a physical burden. He knew he could not leave this unresolved. The sin was not buried, it was active, restless, crying out through the vessel of an innocent boy. As if summoned by the thought, a new sound reached him. It was not the wind, nor the tolling of the bell. It was a faint, almost inaudible sound coming from the direction of the church. It was the sound of a child's voice, whispering. He descended from the attic in a trance, moving through the rectory and out into the twilight. The church doors, which he had locked and bolted himself, stood slightly ajar. A single sliver of pale light from the rising moon cut through the darkness within. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The sanctuary was cavernous and cold, the air utterly still. And there, in the center aisle, was Samuel. The boy was on his knees, his hands clasped before him, in the exact spot where he had first seen the apparition of the old woman. His head was bowed, and he was rocking back and forth almost imperceptibly, whispering to the empty air. The Reverend approached slowly, his soft-soled shoes making no sound on the stone floor. He stopped a few feet behind the boy, straining to hear the whispered words. They were not a prayer. They were a simple, repeated phrase. The boy was saying the words over and over, his voice a monotone, a mere vessel for the message. He was saying that she says it is beneath her. She says it is beneath her. The words were a direct, chilling answer to the unasked question that now screamed in the Reverend's mind. Where was the proof? Where was the body? Margaret Hale was not in her grave in the churchyard. She, or some part of her, was here. The boy's vision was not just seeing a ghost, it was pinpointing a location. The spirit was not just praying, she was keeping vigil over her own desecrated remains. A terrible, sacrilegious resolve began to form in the Reverend's heart. He knew that the bishop would forbid it, that ecclesiastical law would condemn it. But the law of God and the demands of the dead were a higher authority. He would have to unearth the truth, literally. He would have to dig beneath the altar. The decision to desecrate the altar was a profound and terrifying blasphemy, a sin Reverend Alden knew would stain his soul in ways no confession could cleanse. But the sins already staining the church itself were older and deeper, a corruption of the very foundation he had sworn to uphold. The truth, he reasoned with the grim logic of a surgeon preparing to cut into diseased flesh, demanded an incision. He could not approach the church elders or the bishop. Their first instinct would be to protect the institution, to rebury the secret with a fresh layer of piety and silence, just as his predecessor had done 20 years prior. This act required hands that were not bound by faith, but by coin. He sought out 2 workmen from a neighboring village, men who knew nothing of Salem's whispers, or the strange new orphan at the rectory. The first was an older man, his face a roadmap of hard labor, his silence bought by a lifetime of minding his own affairs. The second was his son, a younger man whose brute strength was matched only by a superstitious fear he tried, and failed, to hide behind a veneer of sullen indifference. The Reverend told them only that the foundation beneath the altar had settled and required immediate and discreet inspection. He paid them double their usual wage, in advance, a sum that ensured their loyalty and, more importantly, their silence. They entered the church under the cloak of a moonless night. The only illumination came from 3 oil lanterns, which they placed at the corners of the sanctuary, casting a triangle of nervous, flickering light around the altar. The light barely touched the vaulted ceiling, leaving the upper reaches of the church in an impenetrable, oppressive darkness. The shadows of the three men loomed, monstrous and hunched, against the stone walls. The air was frigid, still, and heavy with the mingled scents of old incense, melting beeswax, and the damp, subterranean chill that seemed to be rising from the flagstones themselves. The Reverend stood to one side, his Bible clutched in a white-knuckled grip, while the two workmen approached the altar with their tools, iron pry bars and heavy mallets. The boy, Samuel, was there as well. The Reverend had tried to make him stay in the rectory to shield him from the night's work, but the boy had been adamant with a quiet, unshakable intensity. He had simply said that he had to be there, that she was waiting. He now sat in the front pew, a small, still figure in the deep shadows. His eyes, which seemed to gather and reflect what little light there was, fixed upon the altar. The older workman knelt, examining the seams between the heavy granite slabs that formed the platform for the altar. He explained in a low murmur that they had been set with incredible care, the mortar as hard as the stone itself. The first hour of their work was a symphony of brutal, jarring sounds that echoed through the cavernous space. The sharp ring of mallets on steel, the guttural scrape of the iron bars forcing their way into the thin seams, the strained grunts of the two men as they put their full weight into the task. It was a violent, ugly process, an assault on the holiest place in the church. The Reverend flinched with every blow, murmuring prayers for forgiveness that felt hollow and useless in the face of such a deliberate sacrilege. Finally, with a great, groaning crack that sounded like a breaking bone, the seal of the first stone gave way. The air that escaped from beneath it was foul, a thick, cloying smell of stagnant water and deep, ancient earth. It was a smell of things that had been denied light and air for far too long. With the first stone dislodged, the others came more easily. Within another hour, they had pried loose a section of the floor directly before the altar, revealing a cavity of packed, black soil beneath. The younger workman took up a shovel and began to dig. The earth was greasy and dense, mixed with fragments of the original foundation stones from the first church built on this spot centuries ago. The sound of the digging was a soft, rhythmic shushing, a stark contrast to the earlier violence. It was a sound of interment, not of excavation, and the Reverend felt a cold dread intensify with every shovelful of earth that was tossed aside. He held one of the lanterns closer to the growing pit, the light glinting off the sweat on the young man's brow. The hole grew deeper, a dark, rectangular wound in the heart of the sanctuary. They were nearly 4 feet down when the sound changed. The shovel, instead of sinking into the soft earth, struck something solid with a dull, wooden thud. The younger workman froze, his eyes wide in the lantern light. The older man knelt, reaching into the pit and brushing the soil away with his bare hands. He looked up at the Reverend, his weathered face pale. He reported that there was a box. Reverend Alden took the lantern and knelt at the edge of the pit himself, the stench of decay now overpowering. He could see it clearly, the dark, damp wood of a small crate or chest, about the size of a parishioner's footlocker. It was wrapped in what looked like oilcloth, but the fabric had rotted through in many places, turning to a black, fibrous slime that clung to the wood. He instructed the men to lift it out. They looped ropes around it and, with a great, collective effort, heaved the box from its grave and onto the stone floor. It landed with a wet, heavy squelch. For a long moment, the three of them simply stood there, breathing heavily, staring at the thing. It seemed to exude a palpable malevolence, a concentration of the sickness that had infected the church. The lid was not nailed shut. The Reverend reached out a trembling hand, his fingers hesitating just above the rotted wood. He looked over at Samuel. The boy had not moved from the pew, but he was leaning forward now, his small body taut with anticipation. Taking a deep breath that filled his lungs with the smell of the grave, the Reverend lifted the lid. The contents were not what he had expected. There was no full skeleton, no jumble of bones. The box was filled mostly with the same dark, wet soil from the pit, but nestled in the center, carefully arranged as if for display, was an object of profound and specific horror. It was the delicate, osseous structure of a human hand and forearm. The bones stained a dark brown from their long interment in the damp earth. The skeletal fingers were slightly curled, as if in the final throes of agony, or, perhaps, in a gesture of prayer. And there, on the fourth finger of the skeletal hand, was a simple gold band, its luster dulled by a patina of decay. Set into the band was a single small black stone. It was the ring from the boy's charcoal drawing. It was the ring of Margaret Hale. The proof was absolute, irrefutable, and more horrific than he could have imagined. They had not just buried a body to hide a theft. They had dismembered her, burying the evidence of their crime in pieces. A final, brutal act of desecration to ensure her silence. He had found the source of the haunting, the unholy relic that tethered a murdered soul to this sacred place. A profound, deathly silence descended upon the church, broken only by the dripping of the lantern oil and the ragged sound of the workmen's breathing. The revelation was so monstrous it seemed to have sucked all the air from the sanctuary. It was in this vacuum of absolute silence that the new sound erupted. It was a scream. It was not the sound of a frightened child, but a high, piercing shriek of pure, unadulterated rage and anguish, a sound that seemed to tear through the veil of the world. It came from Samuel. The boy was standing now, his small body rigid, his arm outstretched, pointing not at the box, but at the dark, empty space above the desecrated altar. His face was a mask of terror and fury. He screamed a single, chilling phrase. He screamed that she was watching, and as the final syllable of his cry echoed and died in the oppressive darkness of the rafters, every flame in the sanctuary was extinguished at once. The 3 lanterns, scattered across the stone floor, went out simultaneously, not as if blown by a draft, but as if snuffed by a single, invisible, and utterly malevolent hand. They were plunged into absolute, pitch-black darkness, a blackness made deeper and more terrifying by the lingering, greasy smell of burnt wicks, the cold stench of the open grave, and the certain, suffocating knowledge that they were not alone. The Reverend, scrambling for safety, knew he had to get the boy out, to send him away from this corrupted ground. But as he found Samuel in the dark, the boy's voice came again, a whisper now, calm and resolute in the terrifying blackness. He insisted that she was not finished praying. The immediate aftermath of the revelation was chaos, a maelstrom of terror in a vortex of absolute darkness. The younger workman cried out, a raw, animal sound of pure fear, scrambling away from the desecrated altar and the profane box it had concealed. The older man, more stoic but no less terrified, fumbled blindly for his tools, his breath coming in harsh, ragged gasps. Reverend Alden, his own heart a frantic drum against his ribs, fought against a wave of paralyzing dread. His first and only coherent thought was for the boy. He stumbled through the blackness, his hands outstretched, calling Samuel's name. He found him standing perfectly still, a small, solid point of calm in the swirling panic. He grabbed the boy's thin shoulders, a desperate anchor in the suffocating dark. He felt Samuel turn his head, and though he could not see his face, he knew the boy's eyes were on him. Samuel spoke, his voice the quiet, simple tone of a child, a shocking contrast to the unearthly scream that had preceded it. He told the Reverend that the woman was no longer angry. He said she was sad. That simple, tragic statement cut through the Reverend's fear with the clean, cold precision of a scalpel. He managed to find his matches, his fingers clumsy and trembling, and relight one of the lanterns. The sudden bloom of light was a physical relief, pushing back the oppressive blackness to a nervous, wavering circle. In the unsteady light, he saw the faces of the workmen, pale and slick with sweat, their eyes wide with the horrors they had witnessed. He pressed a wad of bills into the older man's hand, more money than they had agreed upon, and told them to leave. He ordered them to speak of this to no one, a command enforced not by his pastoral authority, which lay in ruins on the floor, but by the shared, unspoken terror of what lay in the open pit. They fled without a word, their heavy boots echoing as they ran from the sanctuary, leaving the great doors gaping open to the night. The Reverend was left alone with the boy, the open grave, and the terrible skeletal proof of a 20-year-old crime. He covered the box with the rotted cloth, a gesture of respect that felt absurdly inadequate. Then, taking Samuel by the hand, he led him from the church, back to the fragile and now utterly fraudulent safety of the rectory. He sent the boy to his room, his mind racing, trying to formulate a plan. He had unearthed the truth, but the truth was a ravenous, living thing. It could not be simply reburied. The act of exposing the sin had unleashed a power he could not comprehend, let alone control. He knew he had to send Samuel away, to remove the catalyst from this volatile spiritual equation. He would send him to a distant parish, to a cousin in another state, anywhere that was not this cursed ground. He sat in his study, the sealed ledgers of his predecessor on the desk before him, a testament to the long, patient malevolence of secrets. As he sat there, the night itself began to change. The wind, which had been moaning softly around the eaves, rose to a mournful howl. A low, distant rumble answered it, a tremor that seemed to vibrate up through the very floorboards. A storm was coming, a storm of biblical intensity, as if the heavens themselves were preparing to pass judgment. Rain began to lash against the window panes, first as a whisper, then as a frantic, percussive drumming. A flash of lightning bleached the world outside white for a split second, followed a heartbeat later by a crack of thunder so violent it shook the rectory to its foundations. The storm was a physical manifestation of the Reverend's own internal tempest. His faith, his identity, his understanding of the world, all lay in ruins. He was the pastor of a charnel house, a keeper of a murderer's legacy. Through the roar of the wind and rain, he heard another sound, a faint, melodic thread. At first, he dismissed it as the wind whistling through a cracked pane of glass, but it persisted, a quiet, coherent melody weaving its way through the chaos of the storm. It was the sound of a hymn, one he had not heard sung in his church for years, an old, melancholy tune that Margaret Hale had been known to favor. He stood, a cold premonition gripping him. The sound was not coming from outside, it was coming from within the house. He ran from the study and up the narrow stairs to the attic. He threw open the door to Samuel's room. It was empty. The small bed was undisturbed. The window on the far wall was open, the curtains whipping wildly in the wind, letting in the cold, wet air. The boy was gone. Reverend Alden knew, with a certainty that transcended logic, where Samuel had gone. He had been guided back to the church, drawn by a spiritual magnetism he could not resist. The Reverend did not even pause to find a coat. He ran out into the storm, the wind tearing at his clothes, and the rain plastering his hair to his scalp in seconds. The short distance across the churchyard became an epic journey against the fury of the elements. The night was a maelstrom of roaring wind, driving rain, and the percussive, deafening blasts of thunder. Lightning flashed intermittently, illuminating the writhing trees and ancient tombstones in stark, terrifying tableaus. He saw the church ahead, a great, dark monolith against the violent sky, its doors still open as he had left them, and from within, spilling out into the storm-tossed night, was a faint, steady glow of candlelight. Others had seen it too. A small group of parishioners, perhaps a dozen in all, were huddled near the entrance, their faces pale and fearful in the ambient flashes of lightning. A neighbor, woken by the storm, had seen the lights and the open doors and had raised the alarm, fearing vandals or fire. Now they stood transfixed, held at bay by a phenomenon far stranger and more terrifying than any common crime. The Reverend pushed through the small, silent crowd and stepped into the sanctuary. The sight that greeted him stopped his heart. The church was not empty. Dozens of candles, every votive and candelabra in the building, were lit, their combined flames creating a warm, golden, and deeply unnatural glow that seemed to push back against the storm raging outside. The air was thick with the scent of beeswax and ozone, a strange perfume of piety and raw power. And there, kneeling before the open pit, before the exhumed box and the desecrated altar, was Samuel. His back was to the door, his small form illuminated like a figure in a sacred painting. He was not praying, he was speaking, and the voice that echoed in the vast, silent space of the church was not the voice of a 9-year-old boy. It was the voice of an adult woman, clear and resonant, filled with a profound and ancient sorrow. It was a voice that commanded the absolute attention of all who heard it, a voice that seemed to vibrate in the very stones of the church. The parishioners who had followed the Reverend inside gasped, their hands flying to their mouths. They saw the boy, but they heard the woman. Reverend Alden walked slowly down the center aisle, his wet boots leaving dark footprints on the stone floor. He felt no fear now, only a vast, tragic sense of awe. He was witnessing the culmination of it all, the final, desperate act in a drama that had begun 20 years ago. He understood now. Samuel was not a seer of ghosts. He was a vessel, an innocent chalice chosen to hold the bitter wine of a spirit's final prayer. The boy's purity, his soul unmarked by the sins and compromises of the world, had made him a perfect conduit for a justice that the church itself had denied. The voice continued, a steady, lyrical flow of words. It was a confession, a lament, and a plea. Speaking through the boy's lips, Margaret Hale told her story. She spoke of her discovery of the theft, of her faith in the man who had been her spiritual guide. She spoke of his counsel of silence, a counsel she had dutifully obeyed. She spoke of the sudden illness, of the doctor who had seemed more confused than concerned, of the strange, bitter taste of the tea the priest had brought to her bedside each evening. And she spoke of her final, terrifying moments, of a weakness that was not of God, but of man, of a fading light and a dawning, horrific understanding of the betrayal. The voice did not speak with anger. It spoke with an immense, heartbreaking weariness, the weariness of a soul that had been tethered to its own grave, forced to watch over its own desecration, praying for 2 decades not for vengeance, but for the simple, cleansing power of the truth. It was her final prayer, a plea for her story to be heard, for the sanctity of the space she had loved to be restored, not by covering a crime, but by confessing it. The parishioners wept openly, their fear replaced by a profound, shared grief. They were not witnessing a demonic possession, but a holy and terrible testimony. This was Margaret Hale's final sermon, delivered through the most innocent of pulpits. As the first, pale fingers of dawn began to touch the high stained glass windows, the storm outside began to subside. The thunder retreated, and the frantic drumming of the rain softened to a gentle patter. The voice in the church faltered, growing softer, weaker, as if its purpose was nearly complete. With a final, whispered plea for the truth to be entered into the record, the voice fell silent. The candles flickered, and Samuel, the small mortal vessel, crumpled to the floor, his service rendered, his body finally released from its sacred burden. The Reverend knelt beside him, the first rays of morning light illuminating the tear tracks on his own face. The night of prayer was over. As dawn broke, Reverend Alden knew what he had to do. He went to his study, took out a fresh sheet of paper, and began to write his own confession. The dawn that broke over Salem was unnaturally quiet, the fury of the storm having scoured the world clean, leaving behind a sky the color of a fresh bruise and an air that smelled of wet earth and shattered leaves. Inside the rectory, the only sound was the slow, deliberate scratch of a steel nib on heavy paper. Reverend Elias Alden sat at his desk, the flickering light of a single candle pushing back against the gray morning. The night had stripped him of everything: his faith, his office, his belief in the sanctity of the institution he had served for more than 2 decades. All that remained was a single, terrible duty. He was no longer a pastor shepherding a flock, but a scribe recording the final testament of a damned place. His confession was not a plea for forgiveness. It was a forensic accounting of a soul, both his own and that of the church. With a hand that did not tremble, he detailed it all. He began with the arrival of the boy, Samuel Harker, the quiet orphan who had become a reluctant prophet. He then recounted the visions, the charcoal drawing of the ring, and the chilling discovery in the parish ledgers, the documents that proved a crime but not its full horror. He wrote of the desecration of the altar, the unearthing of the small wooden box, and the sight of the dismembered hand, the jet ring, a single, black eye staring up from the grave. He named his predecessor, Father Whitcomb, not as a man who had erred, but as a murderer and a thief, a man who had used the very rituals of comfort and faith as instruments of poison and concealment. He confessed his own sin, the sin of willful blindness, of serving a lie he had not yet known existed. He detailed the events of the previous night, the storm, the unearthly communion, and the final, sorrowful prayer of Margaret Hale, spoken through the lips of an innocent boy. He wrote until his hand ached, and the candle had burned down to a sputtering pool of wax. As the full light of morning finally filled the study, he signed his name, not as a reverend, but as a witness. He sealed the confession in a heavy envelope, addressing it to the bishop, an act that he knew was the final, official end of his life as he had known it. His penance had begun. His first thought, once the document was complete, was for Samuel. He felt a profound, protective urge to see the boy, to ensure he was safe after the terrible ordeal his body and spirit had endured. He climbed the stairs to the attic, his legs heavy with exhaustion and the weight of his future. He pushed open the door to the small room, expecting to find the boy asleep. The room was empty. A profound stillness had taken the place of the boy's quiet presence. The bed was neatly made, the thin blanket pulled taut. On the pillow, where the boy's head should have been, lay a single object, a small, worn Bible, the one Samuel had arrived with. It was open to a specific passage. The Reverend picked it up, his thumb brushing against the delicate, almost translucent paper. The book was open to the Gospel of Matthew, the 5th chapter. A single verse was underlined, not in ink, but by a faint indentation, as if pressed by a fingernail. It read, "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God." In that moment, the Reverend understood. Samuel Harker had not run away. His purpose here was complete. He had been a vessel, a messenger, a lens of pure heart through which a corrupt world could be seen for what it truly was. And now, his message delivered, he was gone, vanished from Salem as quietly and mysteriously as he had arrived. no trace of him was ever found again. He simply ceased to be, leaving behind only the earth-shattering truth he had been sent to reveal. The Reverend's confession landed upon the diocesan authorities like a thunderclap. An official delegation arrived within days, somber men in dark suits who moved with the quiet, grim efficiency of undertakers. The church was sealed, declared unhallowed ground. Under the cold, clinical gaze of these men, the pit before the altar was fully excavated, and Margaret Hale's official plot in the churchyard was opened. Her coffin was found to be filled with stones, a dead weight to mimic a body that had never been there. The rest of her remains were recovered from various locations beneath the church floor, a grisly confirmation of the dismemberment the Reverend had described. The truth, once revealed, was a contagion. The reputation of the First Parish Church was shattered, its history forever rewritten. The parish was formally dissolved, its congregations scattering to other houses of worship, carrying with them a story they would only tell in hushed, fearful whispers for generations to come. Reverend Alden was quietly and permanently removed from his position, stripped of his collar, and sent to a remote monastery for a life of penance and silence, a ghost in his own life story. For months, the church stood empty, a dark, silent monument to its own hypocrisy. The townspeople avoided it, their paths curving around the churchyard as if the ground itself were poisoned. The building began to decay, paint peeling from the doors, weeds choking the stone steps. It was a place of profound shame, a physical manifestation of a spiritual collapse. The end came in the spring of the following year, 1875. It came, fittingly, in a storm. It was not a long, raging tempest like the one that had accompanied Margaret Hale's final prayer, but a sudden, violent squall that seemed to come from nowhere. Witnesses reported a single, blinding bolt of lightning, a jagged spear of pure white fire that descended from the black sky and struck the base of the church spire. The sound was not thunder, it was an explosion, a cataclysmic crack that shattered windows for blocks around. The ancient stone and timber, already weakened by a rot that was more than merely physical, could not withstand the blow. With a great, groaning roar, the spire twisted and fell, and the roof collapsed in upon itself. The stone walls buckled and gave way, and the entire structure imploded in a vast, roiling cloud of dust, splintered wood, and shattered history. When the dust finally settled, and the townspeople dared to creep from their homes to gaze upon the ruin, they saw an image of stark and terrible poetry. Where the proud Gothic church had stood for a century, there was now only a mountain of rubble and debris. But in the very center of the devastation, untouched by the collapse, surrounded by a perfect circle of clear ground, stood the altar. The heavy stone slab, which had once been the centerpiece of a sacred lie, now stood alone under the open sky, washed clean by the rain. It was no longer a place of concealment, but a stark, simple monument to the truth that had finally and violently been set free. Was Samuel Harker an angel, a spirit, a messenger sent to force a reckoning? Or was he merely a boy, an innocent soul whose purity acted as a mirror, reflecting a terrifying truth that had been present all along? The records do not say. They only record the Reverend's final, written words before he was taken away, the closing entry in a case file of faith, murder, and redemption. He wrote that perhaps the church was never blind, it was only unwilling to see. The case file on the haunting of the Salem altar is now closed. Our work here is done. To be present when the next historical record is unsealed, subscribe to the Blasphemy Archive, and leave your own final verdict on what you have witnessed in the comments below.